Hi, everyone out there in the virtual world. This is Donna Hoffman, professor of political science, and I want to talk a little bit about the 2020 presidential election. So, as I'm recording this, the final debate was last night. It has ended. We are in the home stretch. We have about 10 days before election day. It's worth noting that these days we essentially have election season because we have early voting, absentee voting, all kinds of things that we hope culminates on election night in telling us not just who the president's going to be, but also the control of Congress, state houses across the country, lots of things that we vote on. We fixate on the presidential election, which is in some ways a disservice to our democracy and our Constitution, because Americans generally think the president is the government. But in fact, if you look at the Constitution, you'll find the president in Article 2. Congress is in Article 1. Nevertheless, because the president is that one person and is the only office nationally that we elect, there's a lot of attention given to the presidency. And certainly the presidency is important in our system of government, but not maybe the most important thing. And it's always worth remembering that because of the balance of powers that we seek in our constitutional structure of government. But nevertheless, let's talk about the 2020 presidential election. So it's worth thinking about where we are going into the 2020 election because 2016 essentially is informing how most of us are viewing the upcoming election. So it's worth revisiting briefly 2016. So here are the 2016 Electoral College results. Now, hopefully I don't have to tell anybody that the Electoral College is the thing that actually elects the president. We know that from 2016 because, as we'll see, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by a pretty substantial margin, actually. But Trump would win the Electoral College. And here's a map of the red and blue in the United States. This is oftentimes how you see Electoral College results presented to us. This one is a little bit different, though, because 2016 was a little bit different in that you'll see some different colors in there. And those are what we call the faithless electors. So there was a record number of faithless electors here, 7. Now, there's a caveat there. In one election back in 1872, there were actually 63 faithless electors, but that's because their candidate died before the Electoral College voted. And so they switched to a different person, but that person was going to lose anyway. Horace Greeley was who that was. Nevertheless, we had 7 faithless electors. So that's a record in this kind of circumstance. And so that you see here represented by little circles in different colors, not red and blue. And one of the things about looking at Electoral College maps like this, and you'll see this on 2020 as well, you'll see it on projections right now as well, is that this can be misleading because land doesn't vote. And so you have some really big Western states like Wyoming, like Montana, that have, Montana has a little bit more than 1 million people in it. Wyoming has a little bit more than 500,000 people in it. But the land mass there is large, but land doesn't vote. And so there are different views you can look at with the Electoral College that will take this into account. This is the one that you see most standard. And so it's worth understanding that notion about land doesn't vote. It's people that vote, and then that affects the Electoral College numbers. So you see here the different numbers that states have is reflective of their congressional delegation. It's their 2 senators plus the number of House members they have, which is geared to population. So these numbers reflect the population in that sense. Now, if you were to add these numbers up here, the 2016 results don't add up for Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump to 538 because of those faithless electors. So those 7 faithless electors. So we have 531 votes here divided between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. Trump got 304, you need 270. Clinton got 227, and then those 7 faithless electors are represented here as well. So that's what things look like going in. But this is not the whole story, of course, because we also want to talk about the 2016 popular vote that does not elect the president, but within states does determine what slate of electors is going to be selected for that state. And so we know in the popular vote that Hillary Clinton won it. She won it by almost 3 million votes. You see there the difference. Hillary Clinton got 48.3%, not a majority. Trump got 46.2%. And then key here is the others. So these are people voting for third-party candidates in 2016. It was 5.6% of the total vote. Now, in many ways, we hope to not repeat 2016, where one candidate gets the popular vote, but another candidate wins the Electoral College. Now, we should add here that it's the Electoral College that elects the president. That is our legitimate electoral system. So it is the perception, though, of Americans many times that the popular vote is the thing that matters the most. And it's not necessarily, as we see here. We also know this happened in 2000 as well. But remember that we do want Americans to continue to think that government is legitimate. And while the Electoral College gives legitimately us the president, when that differs from the presidential vote, it can cause some things that might be destabilizing. And those are not things we want to have repeated over and over again if we can help it. How we avoid that is not having close elections in many ways. This election, in terms of the popular vote, again, a difference of 3 million votes, not necessarily close in one way, but nevertheless, the way these votes were distributed within the states allowed for Donald Trump to win the Electoral College, and he legitimately becomes president, because those are the rules that we have. And it's important to note that people who drew up the Constitution did not provide for a popular vote. They didn't prohibit a popular vote, but they didn't provide for it. States began, after some time passed, to use the popular vote to determine which slate of electors would be selected for their state. And that's how we ended up here. The founders did not provide for direct election of the president, and we still don't have direct election of the president. If we were to have direct election of the president, we would be using the popular vote at the national level, but that's not what we do. Now, because of this consternation on the part of the American public in terms of differences in electoral college, differences in popular vote, ideally, right, we want these to match up. That's the best case scenario. But that doesn't always happen. And this can undercut the perception, again, of legitimacy, not actual legitimacy, but sometimes the perception of legitimacy. And so ideally, we want the Electoral College and the popular vote to agree in terms of who wins that. Now, let's note that 2020 is not 2016. Nevertheless, we're coming into 2020 with a lot of framework from 2016. So in talking about this, there's a couple, 4 things here I want to raise in particular. 2020 is not 2016 because we have fewer third-party candidates. Now that needs a little bit of explanation, and I will do that. We have fewer undecided voters coming into this election as well. Talk about that. There's more stability in the polls at the national level. That also needs a caveat that we'll explore. And the favorability rates of the candidates in 2020 is very different than it was in 2016. So let's take each one of these and some visuals here and explore this. So the first one, there are fewer third-party candidates. Now here's 2 ballots. On the left, you'll see the ballot from 2016, actually from Polk County. On the right is the ballot from this election. It's actually from Woodbury County, state of Iowa. So both of these are Iowa ballots. And it's important to note that ballots look different from state to state. But here's what they look like in 2016 versus 2020. Now, in sheer number, you may think, oh, well, it's about the same in terms of the third-party candidates here. But in fact, on the left there, you have Gary Johnson and Jill Stein, who received a small percentage of the vote, but a percentage of the vote that actually registered. Whereas as the other candidates, we had to kind of combine them up into the other category. On the right side on this particular year, there's not a similar third-party candidate of the stature of those 2 candidates, although I will note Kanye West is on there. But nevertheless, we don't expect any of these candidates, these third-party candidates, to garner much by way of the popular vote. It's interesting to note that on the ballot on the right, parties are represented there. If you have a party, Kanye West doesn't have one. There's Genealogy Know Your Family History Party. I don't even know what that is about. So in Iowa in particular, it's pretty easy to get on the ballot. That's not true in every state. So when you look at other states, you won't see the same slate of candidates. You'll see the Democrat and the Republican, but there are some states, for example, in which Kanye West did not qualify for the ballot. And that's an important point to note here, is that states are the ones that administer their elections. And they have different rules for how you qualify for a ballot. But regardless, the larger point here is third-party candidates, we don't expect them to garner that 5.6% that we saw them getting in 2016. Now, another reason why 2020 is not 2016, there are fewer undecided voters. So in mid-September of 2016, there were about 19%, surveys told us, of people who were either undecided or voting for a third-party candidate. About the same period in 2020, that number was about 9%. Mid-October in 2020, we only have about 6% who are telling the pollsters, this one from the New York Times, that they are undecided or refuse to indicate their presidential preference. So there's less people are undecided going into this election. And we know in 2016 that in the last week, those undecided voters vote disproportionately for Donald Trump. 2020 is not 2016 when we look at national polling. Now, again, national polling only kind of gives us the popularity picture. This is what approximates the popular vote, which again is not what elects the president. Nevertheless, we look at this a lot. What you really want to look to if you want to try to predict the Electoral College is the polling in states. That can be a little more dicey because not all states are polled. The swing states tend to be polled, but those also can be, and were in 2016, have a little bit more error in them. Nevertheless, let's compare here the average from RCP, Real Clear Politics, in national poll averages. Trump Biden on the top, Trump Clinton in 2016. And you'll see much more stability in those polls in 2020. Then you see that variability there in the polls on the Trump Clinton race. And again, this approximates the national popular vote, which Clinton won by 2%, basically. The polls were not wrong here. Where polls had the issues, again, were in some of the key states that were very close, and every poll has error. But nevertheless, this is what the polls look like. So there's a little bit more stability here. Close states in 2016, it's worth noting, especially Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, were three states that were very, very close. It was in the margin of error when you look at polling in those states. And if you add up the number of votes Trump won those three states by, it was less than 80,000 votes. So really, and those three states were pivotal. So remember the difference between national polling and state polling. This is just a picture of the national polling here. Now, 2020 is not 2016. Also, when we look at the favorability ratings of the candidates, this again averages from polls that Real Clear Politics did. Now, I've moved these polls around a little bit so that they're a little bit more comparable. You want to look at the scale on the left of each of these because the scale is very different. So in 2016, it was really unusual that both candidates were largely unpopular, meaning they were viewed unfavorably by a large segment of the electorate. And so you see there, Donald Trump was viewed less favorably than Hillary Clinton, but Hillary Clinton wasn't viewed favorably by the electorate either. And so you see that. So you note there on the left in 2016 that the scale actually starts at -5. Okay, so neither of these candidates got into the positive territory on favorability. We go over to 2020 and we compare Biden and Trump here. And again, I tried to adjust the scale, but it's not exactly comparable. But note where the 0 is here. And note that there have been times when Joe Biden has gotten into positive territory, and going into the last stretch of the election, he's in positive territory. And when you really see that starting to happen was about the time right before the first debate and after the first debate. And so Joe Biden is actually viewed more positively than negatively by the electorate, but that's not true of Trump. So both candidates are not equally unpopular in this sense, or equally viewed unfavorably in this sense, as we kind of saw in 2016. So that's another factor here as well. So those are the four things that are really different. Now, before we end this, let's look at, again, that map going back to 2016 there on the left, the Electoral College map, and then a projection based on state polling as it is done right now. This is 270 to wins chart. And you will see the brown, of which Iowa is one. Those are the toss-up states or the swing states. Those are the ones that we really want to look at going into the election. The light blue, closer margins, the dark blue, pretty much a lock for Biden. The dark red, pretty much a lock for Trump. The light red, maybe a little bit of question there. But really those toss-up states, of which there's some big ones there. Florida typically is in this category. Texas, interestingly enough, in this category based on polling. Arizona is here. Iowa's here. Ohio's typically here. Iowa, quite frankly, is typically here as well. But note that we only have 6 electoral votes, and we have the smallest number of electoral votes in how this is playing out right now. But in tight elections, a few electoral votes here and there can really matter. I will note here, Maine and Nebraska are slash marks here because they do their electoral vote differently. They don't do winner take all, which is what the other states do, meaning that if you win Iowa by 1 vote, you get all the electoral votes. You win Texas by 1 vote, you get all the electoral votes. That's winner take all. Maine and Nebraska do a district system, and currently we expect the Nebraska 2nd district to go for Biden. And there's one of the districts in Maine that might go for Trump. It did in 2016. And so there's 1 vote in Maine and 1 vote in Nebraska. The vote in Maine is a toss-up. The vote in Nebraska is actually light blue. And so that's why you have those stripes there. But this is important to think about as we go into the election. California is not really in doubt, nor is Washington State or Oregon or much of the New England states. Many of the states in the South aren't in doubt for Trump. It's the states where it's in doubt, and Iowa is one of those. And historically, Iowa has been a swing state, and of course, we are again this season as well. Now, as I end this, I want to just say a couple of things about election night. And so on election night, be patient. It takes time to count ballots. This is always true. Always takes time to count ballots. Usually, it is not close enough to make a difference to matter. Sometimes it is. This election is going to be different because we have more absentee votes coming into states, and different states have different rules as to when those absentee votes have to be in, when they can open them, when they can count them. And it will take time to count those ballots, and that's not unusual. Now, another point to make here is, let's go back to 2000. In 2000, Al Gore won the popular vote by a little more than 500,000 votes, and that was clear on election night. What was not clear on election night was who would win Florida. And whoever won Florida won the Electoral College. We didn't know for 5 weeks. It was 5 weeks of litigation, 5 weeks of lots of pundits making proclamations about things that weren't necessarily correct. Nevertheless, it took 5 weeks in 2000. So it's worth noting that it's not unprecedented for it to take a long time. It's not even unprecedented from election to election for states to take time counting. You typically don't see it affecting presidential races, but you do almost always see it affecting some of the congressional races. So remember that it takes time to count ballots, and this is always the case. And the fact that a state may not declare a winner if it's close doesn't mean there's any nefariousness going on. It means that they're trying to get it right. And they have rules that they have to follow to get it right. And if it's very close within a state, some states have rules about automatic recounts. So there could be a lot of complexity here. If it is not close on election night, and then those counts will still take place. Elections take a while to be certified, but small counts on the margins won't determine the winner if it's not a close election. So just remember to be patient on that sense. Remember that the Supreme Court is not a normal participant in an election. They don't play a role here unless there is a dispute, and a dispute that raises a constitutional question. Many of the disputes coming out of elections that are litigated are actually litigated in state courts. And so in 2000, we did see the Supreme Court become a player, but that was highly unusual. And I mentioned this because we have an unusual situation coming into 2020, where one of the reasons that Republicans mentioned for rushing the nomination of Amy Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court was in case the Supreme Court had to decide the election. Because without Amy Coney Barrett on it, it's a 4-4 split. That's really an interesting argument, again, when you think that the Supreme Court's not a normal player here. Could be a player. They were a player in 2000, but we would not expect that. Also recognize that protest is a constitutionally protected right. Of course, it has to be peaceful. This is an election with a lot of high emotion, and somebody's going to lose. And the supporters of whoever loses here may react in very different ways. And one of those ways may be protest. However, that protest needs to be peaceful in that sense. And so remember that protest is constitutionally protected. It needs to be peaceful. And then also the last thing to point out here is recognize that it is a hallmark of American elections that there is a peaceful transition of power. This is one of the things that Washington established when he left office after 2 years, when we had power then later transition from one party to another. Transition has been orderly, the transition has been peaceful. This has been undercut somewhat by Donald Trump saying he might not necessarily recognize the results of the election, undercutting the legitimacy of the election. But let me stress here that the administration of American elections is decentralized again. And while, yes, there are problems on the margins, generally speaking, we have a lot of faith, and we should have a lot of faith in this. There are always problems. There's always error again. But by and large, American elections traditionally have been administered very fairly. And so understand that we want to be able to trust our elections. If we can't trust our election returns, then we have severe problems as a democracy. And so again, take a deep breath on election night, be patient, wait for the counts to play out. If it is a close election, it will take some time for that to happen. So these are some of the pointers and kind of context we want to have going into the 2020 election, especially here using 2016 as kind of our marker for some of the things we might be thinking about. So I hope you have a plan to vote. I hope, in fact, that you've already voted. If you haven't, you can still vote on election day. Make sure you know how to do that, because voting is particularly important in a democracy.